How do you see our relationship with Europe? Do we have more in common with them, or are we more kind of pulling back and taking care of business at home?
I think that Europe, and frankly, I would have said this about America a year ago, but Europe is at risk, I think, of engaging in civilizational suicide. You see them starting to limit the free speech of their own citizens, even as those citizens are protesting against things like the border invasion that got Donald Trump and a number of European leaders elected.
What if JD Vance is right about Europe? What if beneath the progressive facade of European capitals, the foundations of Western democracy are indeed crumbling under the weight of uncontrolled migration and speech restrictions? Or is Vance cynically exploiting European challenges to advance an America First agenda? Today we're examining the evidence behind his provocative claims at the Munich Security Conference, separating legitimate critiques from political posturing to understand what's truly at stake in this transatlantic ideological divide. Before we move on, I'd like to ask you a small favor. If you appreciate this content, please take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Over 98% of you watch the videos without subscribing. It costs you nothing, but it makes a huge difference to us. So, did you click the subscribe button? Great, thank you so much. Now, back to the video. Imagine a world where Europe's harshest critic isn't Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping, but America's new Vice President JD Vance. During February's Munich Security Conference, Vance didn't just ruffle feathers, he set the diplomatic aviary ablaze by accusing European leaders of civilizational suicide. This wasn't mere hyperbole. Vance meticulously constructed his indictment with specific examples that left European officials visibly shaken.
I want Europe to thrive. I want them to be an important ally. Part of that is going to be Europe respecting its own people, respecting its own sovereignty, and America can't do that job for them.
The Democrats are claiming they really target you, are stoking a division between Europe and the United States, and that's not going to be easily repaired.
Well, look, I think friends have to have stark conversations with one another. And the simple truth is that when we look at Europe, we see a great civilization, obviously a great ally of the United States.
The vice president pointed to Romania's decision to postpone local elections, Sweden's laws criminalizing Quran burning, and Britain's arrests of religious protesters as evidence of democratic backsliding. While European leaders responded with indignation, Vance remained unfazed. His core diagnosis was devastating in its simplicity. Europe refuses to control its borders while simultaneously restricting its citizens' fundamental rights. This paradox forms the foundation of what we might call the Vance Doctrine. He argues that Europe's open immigration policies have diluted national identities, creating parallel societies resistant to cultural integration. But rather than addressing this challenge directly, European governments have instead chosen to restrict their own citizens' speech rights, effectively punishing the native population for voicing concerns about the consequences of mass migration. And perhaps most provocatively, Vance likened European elites' use of terms like misinformation and disinformation to Soviet-style censorship tactics. In his view, these labels aren't neutral tools for maintaining truth, but weapons wielded against political opponents. He cited Germany's firewall strategy against the AfD party as a prime example of establishment figures circumventing democratic processes when voters choose incorrectly. What makes Vance's critique particularly cutting is how it transcends isolated incidents to identify a systemic pattern. For him, these aren't discrete policy missteps, but symptoms of a broader civilizational decline, one where Western leaders prioritized abstract internationalism over the welfare of their own citizens. French President Emmanuel Macron's reaction was particularly revealing. Rather than addressing Vance's specific claims, Macron dismissed them as distorted generalizations that undermine the very alliance structures that have preserved peace. This defensive posture only reinforced Vance's argument that European elites are unwilling to engage with criticisms that challenge their fundamental worldview. Beyond public speeches and media appearances, the true character of Vance's diplomatic vision emerges in the private chambers of power. When Ukrainian President Zelensky arrived at the Oval Office seeking continued American support, he encountered a startling new dynamic in alliance politics, a demand for gratitude before assistance. Offer some words of appreciation for the United States of America and the president who's trying to save your country, Vance reportedly told Zelensky, transforming what should have been a strategic meeting into something resembling a loyalty test. This confrontational approach marks a fundamental shift in how America views its relationships with allies. Rather than partnerships built on shared democratic values and mutual security interests, Vance's framework operates on explicitly transactional terms. His dismissal of European security guarantees was particularly revealing, characterizing them as 20,000 troops from some random country that hasn't fought a war in 30 or 40 years, language that shocked traditional security experts. The vice president's comments provoked immediate backlash from European officials. British lawmaker James Cartledge called Vance's characterization deeply disrespectful, highlighting the sacrifices made by British and French forces in recent conflicts. This defensive response underscores how Vance's remarks struck at the heart of NATO's collective defense principle, the idea that an attack on one is an attack on all. Perhaps most revealing is Vance's novel proposal for ensuring Ukraine's future security. In a Fox News interview, he suggested that a critical minerals deal would provide better protection than military commitments. If you want real security guarantees, if you want to actually ensure that Vladimir Putin does not invade Ukraine again, the very best security guarantee is to give Americans economic upside in the future of Ukraine. This statement reveals the core of Vance's foreign policy worldview. American economic interests, not shared values or democratic principles, should drive international relationships. This economic-first approach extends to NATO itself, where Vance has called for members to increase defense spending to an unprecedented 5% of GDP, more than double the current 2% target that many European nations already struggle to meet, and significantly above America's own 3.4% allocation. Such demands reflect Vance's broader critique of European free riding on American security guarantees. The confrontational style employed by the vice president stems from his conviction that European political establishments have become disconnected from ordinary citizens' concerns. By challenging alliance orthodoxies and demanding concrete economic benefits, Vance presents himself as speaking for everyday Americans who question the value of international commitments that seem to deliver few tangible returns. This ideological rift between Vance and Europe transcends mere policy disagreements. It fundamentally challenges what Western democracy should look like in the 21st century. As European leaders grapple with rising nationalism within their borders, Vance's America First vision forces an uncomfortable reckoning about transatlantic relations that have anchored global security for decades. The Trump-Vance administration appears poised to leverage Europe's internal struggles to reshape these long-standing partnerships. European leaders now face mounting pressure not only to increase defense spending, but to demonstrate their relevance to an America increasingly skeptical of foreign entanglements. This pressure arrives as nationalism surges across the continent, creating a volatile political landscape where Vance's stark warnings might resonate with disaffected voters. Ultimately, the future of these transatlantic bonds won't be decided in Washington or Brussels, but in ballot boxes across Europe. As citizens weigh competing visions for their future, they'll render the true verdict on whether Vance's diagnosis represents prophetic insight or American overreach.